COVID-19 pandemic really upended everything about our lives. We saw demand destruction. We saw the systems that we had in place were completely disrupted. And then we had to be agile and resilient. And then suddenly we saw policymakers trying to figure out the best way forward to protect lives and then livelihoods. And it was a huge dilemma. So when we look at policy and how it can transform people's lives, policy isn't something that is easily implemented. You have to have everyone thinking the same and on the same page and believing in that policy. It is my honor to welcome Christian Stadler, the Professor of Strategic Management at Warwick Business School, to join us. So welcome on stage. He's going to speak for 10 minutes to give us an overview, and then we'll get into a conversation.
Okay.
Welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So in 2012, Ashok Vaswani became the CEO of Barclays retail business in the United Kingdom. This was at a time when it started to become obvious that the world is going more mobile, is going more online. And obviously, as a senior business leader, he would have known that. He could, at this particular point in time, hired a group of consultants to help him and the senior leadership team to mint out a new strategy for the digital era. But he also knew that he's working in a 325-year-old organization with 30,000 people working in retail in the United Kingdom. So simply presenting them with a way forward would be pretty threatening for them. It would, for many of them, question how should they move forward? What does it mean for their own job? So instead of simply dictating the way forward, he decided to involve people. He did so in 2 stages. In the first stage, he set up various working groups, some of them representing the different expertise areas of the company, some of them involving young people who were not tainted by the existing culture and way of working and thinking in Barclays to develop ideas for the future. In the second stage, he really involved every one of those 30,000 people working in Barclays. He set up town hall meetings throughout the country where they rented out cinemas, and they did a digital process. They set up a strategy jam, which you can think of a bit like a conference where you have different breakout sessions. Each of them will be moderated, so somebody's making sure that people stay on topic, also can make connections between some of the themes discussed in other sessions. And there is artificial intelligence sitting behind of that helps you both to analyze and also make connections throughout this process. When I talked to Ashok, he was amazed of how successful this particular process was. They were able to increase the return on equity from 15 to 17% in an industry that is highly contested, where there are new competitors from fintech coming in. Shortly after the jam, they were setting up a mobile app that was, in a short period of time, gathering 1 million users, and today, with 9 million users, is one of the most successful fintech products in the United Kingdom. That's quite an achievement for an organization that is facing new competition that can start from zero. The conversations that took place in these online forums, they were vibrant, they were real. So for example, in the mortgage department, people were pointing out that if you order a pizza on Domino's, a big pizza delivery chain in the United Kingdom, then they can tell you when you made the order, they can tell you when they put the ingredients on the pizza, they can tell you when the pizza goes in the oven, they can tell you when the pizza comes out of the oven, and they can tell you when the pizza is on the way to you. In the mortgage department in Barclays at this particular point in time, people could only tell you when the application came in, and at the very end they could tell you either you get a mortgage under whichever conditions, or you do not get a mortgage. Now this is obviously not in sync with how this digital age is actually transforming the life of so many people. You had, once this process was completed, also people who were a bit more literate on the digital side, setting themselves up to help others in an initiative called the Digital Eagles. You had even sort of funny episodes where a grandfather walked into one of the Barclays branches with his new iPad and asked if they could help him set up his iPad because he thought, his grandson has told him that Barclays are the people who know digital. Now, obviously, Barclays is not a computer shop, but they really arrived in this digital age. Why am I telling you this? The private sector has been slowly but surely, quietly transforming their strategy making process into a more open approach. There's roughly about a third of strategic initiatives today that are open at least to one or some extent. But these 1/3 of initiatives, they generate about half the profits and revenues of organizations. So it is, a new way to deal with some of the more tricky issues. It's a new way that I think can also help you in the government sectors to deal with a couple of particular big and persistent issues. One of them is in the policy era. Now, I'm not a policymaker myself, I'm a strategy professor. But I've talked to one of the most senior policymakers for NATO in the Pentagon. And he told me, some of you might correct me having more experience in this, but what he told me is that typically the way policy is made is there's a few people who know each other quite well over a long period of time. They think alike, they come up with some ideas, and they think that once they propose these ideas to the world, then either others will jump onto them in big enthusiasm, or if not, then they can be coerced to follow. Now, he also said the reality, of course, is quite different, where those ideas that are developed somewhere in the back rooms by a small group of people find it really, really hard to get traction. How do you mobilize people if they're not involved? So the answer really is that you can create a process not so different from the strategy process that Barclays had, where you involve people in the policy field early on. In fact, this is something that NATO and the European Union did in early 2020 when COVID first hit and when they were trying to consider the security implications for that. Mike Ryan, who was a policymaker in the US, initiated this. He brought together first a smaller team from the European Union and NATO with people from 5 different think tanks to plan the process. And then they set up a 2-day online strategy jam, I would call it, where they had 2,800 people involved in that process, including 150 who they referred to as super VIPs, so ministers, very senior policymakers. And according to him, the outcome was policy making on warp speed. So obviously, you don't change the world overnight, but you had a clear agreement among those participants in the process, and following on that, the policymakers in the European Union and NATO, that the dragon bear effect, as they called the challenge from Russia and China, was demanding the foremost attention. Now you might say, well, that's right obvious, isn't it? But the reality is that shortly before this initiative, the United Kingdom, for example, was considering UA to deliver their 5G network, which was something that was quietly dropped, or maybe not quite quietly. They also set up a new initiative in the European Union to filter any foreign direct investment as a result, not purely of that process, but partly sped it along by this particular process. So what the opening up can achieve here is it creates a motivation for all those involved. It creates an ability to already consider the various options that affect them as well. The second big issue that I think we face in many government areas today is polarization. And maybe not so much the ones who work in the government sector, but they face strong polarization around some of the big topics of this time. Think social justice, think climate change, think immigration. All of them, what typically happens, we find ourselves in our own little groups where we all agree, and occasionally we shout at the other group. Social media that drives a lot of those conversations, in fact, has core mechanisms that compartmentalizes us into our own echo chambers. Now imagine a world where we use a technique similar to the one that has been used by NATO and the European Union, similar to the one that has been used by Barclays to create their strategy, where you have a moderated process where large groups of people can participate, but do so in a civil manner, where they not just shout at each other, but they are forced to think about solutions in this area. Now, I know that this works because there's been some research by Joshua Becker from the University of Pennsylvania with two of his colleagues, where they took, in fact, quite homogeneous groups, Republicans, and in a separate experiment, Democrats, and asked them around some of these topics that are particularly polarizing. And then noticed, even within relatively homogeneous groups, by having a large group of them involved, conversations start to be more fact-based and more results-oriented. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would encourage you to think about how you can open some of those processes that you are engaged with, bring people into the conversation, because I know it works. Executives that we asked told us that it creates new ideas, it creates more diversity in ideas, and it creates stronger commitment around those ideas that essentially you're trying to introduce. To be more precise, 69% of the executive told us that there is new and more diverse ideas, and 70% told us that it increases the commitment around these ideas. It might be daunting, it might be a challenge to organize this, but it's doable. The private sector has shown us how it's done, and I think governments can pick up some of those solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Take a seat for me so I can interrogate you now about how this is going to really work. Good to see you, Christian. Really illuminating, and I think, you know, when we discuss what strategy means for governments or for businesses, you're talking about having an open strategy and having flexibility. And we've had to do that. We've had to think so differently during the pandemic. But when it comes to policymakers, if you don't have a clear strategy and able to stick to it, implementation becomes really hard. So what does it mean when you have an open strategy? Does it make it even more difficult to get all government departments to understand what the focal point should be?
Okay, so there's a couple of things that are really important. Yeah, the process matters the way it's done. You can't sort of, turn this into a democratic process as such. Yeah, so there's no vote involved here, but it is one that is moderated, and where it's also clear that in the end the most senior guys involved make the final decisions. But purely by having a voice and being involved, it allows people to think things through, how it affects them, how it affects their department, and it makes them much more likely champions of a new idea. They develop psychological ownership, in essence.
Okay, so when we have unprecedented risks that hit, like we saw during the pandemic, and now we're seeing geopolitical risk that is emerging, where companies and governments are trying to figure out what exposure they have to toxic assets suddenly, or you've got a slowdown in your tourism sector because your biggest markets might have been Russia and Ukraine. How do you implement those real life issues into what you're saying theoretically?
Okay, so one thing could be that you deal with a particular sensitive issue, yeah, and that by airing this sensitive issue, you are afraid that you're revealing too much too early. Yeah. But there's smart ways to deal with that as well, and I'll give you a nice little example. So some of you might have been on a holiday to the western parts of the US in summers. And if you have, then most likely you went to one of the national parks and you probably took some pictures of bison while you were out there, I'm assuming here. Now, we post these pictures, and this could be a nice way for the scientific community to use all this data, in fact, to develop algorithms and then track the movement of bison. One that is much cheaper than having hundreds of people to actually track those bisons. Such a scheme was, in fact, a few years ago, was out there on one of those open platforms where people could develop ideas. And many did. New ideas develop for this algorithm. And I'd love to tell you that, based on this initiative, the bison migration issue was solved. As it turned out, this was actually something set up by the American intelligence community with the intention to use those algorithms of social media posted pictures to track troop movement in Crimea. Now, this was not known to the public at the time, but nonetheless, the wisdom of the crowd was used to solve this problem, and I've been told by the organizer it was done in a very successful manner. If you imagine it would have been, declared that this is with the intention to monitor troop movements, then probably, the Russian intelligence services would have responded to that. They would have tried to maybe submit many good-looking but actually faulty algorithms, and that could be avoided this way.
Okay, fascinating. Okay, so what are the big challenges in, embarking on what you're saying? What would you say the biggest hindrances would be?
So I would say, one actually big hurdle to overcome is from the leadership side to be ready and prepared to do that. I think, most leaders are still molded in a kind of way where in the end they are the ones in charge. They're also the ones who are chiefly in charge of developing the new ideas. That they find themselves as such. And here you become much more of an orchestrator, somebody who is trying to see where you can find different ideas and compose them then all together. So that's, I think, mentally a big challenge for leaders that they have to overcome if they want to engage in a process of that kind.
Okay, so tell me about what you think the biggest risks right now that governments and businesses are facing at the moment.
Well, probably I'm a micro guy in a sense, so that's what strategy professors do. And that would be, strongly compartmentalized depending on which industry you're in which country you're in. At the moment,
can you strategize your way out of the risks, basically?
Can you strategize yourself out of risk? No, you can mitigate them.
Okay.
So you can reduce the impact, and you can certainly, if you had planned for various alternatives that might hit you hard, if you have thought them through, you're in a better place today. Scenario planning is an old technique that has been used by the oil industry since the 70s, and in fact comes out from the war planning department in the United States, where certainly some of the oil companies managed to prepare themselves better for the first oil crisis, and it's a technique continued to be used.
Thank you very much, Christian. Great to have you on. Thank you so much for your insights. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Christian Stadler. Thank you so much.
Thank you.